And coming up on this week's show, £15.6 billion for transport investment outside of London and the South East. Fabulous news. But is any of it new money? Fares evasion is a big problem on the railway, but have train operators been acting irresponsibly in handling it? And we find out more about potential competition for Eurostar through the Channel Tunnel. So welcome to Green Signals from me, Nigel Harris, and...
from me, Richard Bowker.
Well, straight in. It's a big week for the government this week, Richard, with the announcement of its spending review, which we've been talking about for a while, which frustratingly takes place while we're recording this show. However, that does mean we'll have a chance to review it all in detail next week. In the meantime, Richard is going to do a little explainer video on the big takeaways from the review, which will have been published by the time you're watching or listening to this. So do have a look on our YouTube channel for that. On this week's main show, though, we're going to review the pre-announcement that was made last week, suggesting £15.6 billion had been set aside for transport investment, yippee, outside of London and the South East. More of that in a moment. The spending review comes at a difficult time for government. Last year's budget was something of a disaster, with really ill-thought-out strategies and significant tax rises, which, although positioned as making sure businesses paid their fair share, actually ended up having far more of an impact on ordinary working folk than the government would probably like to admit. To use that dreadful cliché, and we do try to avoid that, this spending review has to land well, but that's far from straightforward. Defence needs significant increases. The NHS seems certain to hoover up yet more cash, as it always does, and there are pressures mounting everywhere. And any further tax rises could spell electoral gloom, if not disaster, for the government. Not helpful at a time when support for reform has surged past Labour, in fact surged past everyone else for that matter. To help manage the narrative, another god-awful phrase, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, announced a package of measures on June 4th that seemed on the surface to be very positive news. £15.6 billion in transport investment in the Midlands, the west of England and the north. Even I was kind of punching the air. All good stuff. Or was it, Richard?
Well, I think it's a great question because it's not obvious. I think to understand the context, Nigel, you've got to take a step back in time a little and look at something which was very snappily titled the City Regional Sustainable Transport Settlements, or the CRSTS for short. These are things that were actually a sort of a child of the last government, and they were really designed to sort of level up, if you like, and get investment in transport out of London and South East into the regions. And actually, I sort of dug out the blurb that the government wrote at the time. They said, just as London's capacity and funding was built up over several successive multi-year financial settlements, we intend, subject to future spending reviews, it's always in there, and the success of this programme, that this could be the first of a series of 5-year transport settlements for the city regions, right? The London model will not be achieved overnight, but the journey has started. The direction is clear. So that's what the intention of these CRSTSs for short. Now, there have been 2 of these announced, and they run for 5 years each, as was the plan. The first one, CRSTS1, runs from 2022-23, that's the financial year, to 2026-27. So we're actually still in the middle of that.
Okay.
CRSTS2 was due to run from 27-28 to 31-32. Now, listeners will recall, how could we forget, that Rishi Sunak, when he was Prime Minister, put the cat among the pigeons in October 2023. Can you believe it's that long ago now? When he cancelled HS2 Phase 2 and announced to much fanfare and not a little derision, Network North, which was like a sort of a smorgasbord of disconnected and largely random projects, some of which weren't even in the north, of course. Many had no business case at the time, and quite a few of them were never going to get one either. But nonetheless, that was the announcement.
And some of them had already been built.
And some of them had already been built. I mean, we remember
Trams to Manchester
Door
Airport and all that.
and Door Station, if you recall.
Yeah.
But one byproduct of cancelling HS2 and the creation of Network North was that the government announced that the city regions for CRSTS2, which of course at that time was a few years away, they would actually get an uplifted settlement from what they'd originally been awarded. I guess like a sort of a windfall from the cancellation of HS2.
Okay, I'm with you up to now. And at that time, I recall much glee being trumpeted by Conservative candidates facing mayoral elections and much cynicism from Labour politicians in the North, most being very scathing, principally because of the minibar cancellation of HS2.
Absolutely. And, you know, we remember what Andy Burnham said at the time, and that was kind of reflected across the region, really. Of course, the next thing that happened was that Labour won the election in 2024. And one of the things that they did was they decided to undertake a capital programme review of all the transport projects that the previous government had said would go ahead. And you remember,
yep, I do.
£22 billion black hole, all that kind of unfunded commitments and so on. So in practice, they sort of suspended commitments to CRSTS2. And although in reality, I wonder whether that really made a lot of difference, because of course it wasn't due to kick in until 2027 anyway. But their review said, yeah, hold your horses. What the previous government said, we may not be able to do.
Okay, I'm still with you on one of your forensic exams of what happened in these legislational things. So what's happened now?
Right. So what's happened is that, you know, blow me down with a feather. What the Chancellor's actually done is effectively announced a restart of the programme that the Conservatives had launched with Network North, right? And so the same Labour politicians from October 23 have been jumping up for joy. They've obviously had a bit of a Damascus Road experience. They've seen the light, all the rest of it. But in reality, not much has actually changed. So let me give you an example.
They've unpressed the pause button, effectively.
Well, that's practically that would appear so, right? So if you take West Yorkshire, Leeds and Bradford and that region, post Rishi Sunak's decision in October 2023, the CRSTS2 settlement was uplifted to £2.1 billion.
Okay.
And yet, following the Chancellor's announcement last week, the now rebranded Transport City Region settlement for the same period, 2027 to 28 to 2031-32, is £2.1 billion. This is exactly the same, right? For basically the same stuff. And it's the same for pretty much every region. They've all got the same money now that they had under CRSTS2 when it was uplifted following Network North. Now, the only one that seems slightly different is the West Midlands seems to have lost 200 million quid, and the East Midlands Combined Authority, which didn't actually technically exist in October 23, had an indicative number of 1.5, but that's turned out to be 2 billion. But nonetheless, you know, in effect, as you say, you could say, be cynical and say, we're just going to do what the last lot said we were going to do.
I'm actually really angry because I heard that announcement. I was in the car, I heard the news, and a part of my brain's going, well, good. They're actually showing them, you know, a bit of good news before the bad news from the spending review. And I am really annoyed that I've been hoodwinked and fell for it. And had you not gone for digging into all that, I rather suspect I'd have continued to think, well, this is okay. I feel hoodwinked. I feel as though I have not been honest with. And if you needed yet another example of why people have absolutely had it with mainstream politicians, here it is. You said earlier about reform surging past in terms of, and this is why people are sick and tired of this sort of BS being passed out as being new money when it's actually Conservative money that they've just taken the paws off and hoping to get the political capital for it. And it's outrageous. It is dishonest.
If we're always very balanced on this show.
I don't feel very balanced at the minute.
No. Okay. But we are always very balanced.
We are.
And some will say, yeah, but Network North was just a knee-jerk reaction to a political decision around HS2, and it was all complete pie in the sky and unfunded, whereas now it's going to happen, right? That's what people will say. But actually, to get a bit more reaction to this, I spoke with a guy called David Leader. Now, he's a very well-known figure in the public transport world. He's had a stellar career. He's been chief executive of West Midlands Travel, which is the buses in the West Midlands. So he knows the region very well. He's been group marketing director of National Express Group PLC. He was an NED of non-exec director of GB Rail Freight, a main board member of First Group PLC with responsibility for development.
Okay.
You know, he's a really well-informed guy.
Knows his onions.
He knows his onions. And I asked him what he thought of last week's announcement. And to my surprise, he also had some fascinating opinions on light rail in particular. Here's what David had to say. David, I want to start with this business over the Chancellor's announcements recently on light rail schemes. In October 23, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, cancelled HS2 Phase 2,
yes,
which was a through hit, but he then uplifted all the CRSTS2 values. It was almost like a bit of a windfall, you know, hurrah, and we got loads more light rail schemes coming off the back of it. In July 24, Labour paused them all, right? And now they've just simply restarted them so that the new investment that the Chancellor's announced surely is just Sunak's CRSTS2 settlements writ large. It's the same thing. It just sounds like political spin, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's possibly more to it than that, Richard. But yes, I basically agree with you. I mean, the two things I would add to what you said is, first of all, there's been quite a bit of inflation in the last year. And when you pause these things, of course, restarting them causes a further delay. So it's going to be more than 5 or 6% inflation. In other words, they'll get fewer bangs per buck. I think the second observation I would make is I don't think Sunak's list was probably his own homework in the first place. I think when they decided to cancel the northern leg of HS2, they asked people, what schemes have you got in your top drawers? And, you know, get them out and we'll see whether we can help you fund them. The danger with that is that you have projects that have been hanging around sometimes for decades. I mean, a good example from the Chelsea Hackney line, it's now called Crossrail 2, but that's been knocking around in a top drawer for 100 years. Now, these schemes are not in that order, but they are schemes that people liked. So I don't think a lot of these schemes were subject to brilliant evaluation in the first place. But yeah, I think to be fair to the government, the reason that they did the pause, you could justify a pause, is there's a big public spending problem. And I understand why you'd want to pause. But it looks to me, actually, that the way that they just reinvented this list is in response to the terrible election results. And so my criticism in part would be, well, what did you actually do with the pause? Did you actually subject these schemes to scrutiny, or did you just sort of have a panic after the elections and say, let's get them all going in for the second time? And I think that's where I'm agreeing with you, Richard.
And as a result, make them more expensive because of inflation. No,
Correct.
Fair enough. Now, the Chancellor's, she's very proud of the fact, and I'm sure we're going to hear a great deal of it in the spending review, that because she's changed the way the fiscal rules operate, we can now invest more capital, which apparently is really good, rather than more operating costs, which is not so good. But I mean, arguably, you know, cash is cash, right? But you said something really interesting in a recent LinkedIn post. You said this: if the evidence was overwhelming that transport projects lead to a large and positive impact on economic growth, things might be easier. But I still expect the government to get some short-term mileage from this sophistry, because even city investors tend to be susceptible to the better infrastructure argument, despite its weak factual basis. I mean, wow, that's quite punchy stuff. Are you saying that all these schemes that got announced last week, the 15.6 billion, they're really kind of vanity ideas from sort of some new northern elites, and they're not really going to deliver the benefits that they claim, because infrastructure really doesn't actually do that?
I'm not quite going as far as you're going, Richard, but I'll unpack what I said and tell you what I was trying to get across. So the first point, I think, is that elites, by which I mean, you know, people in politics, journalism, so on, let's call them the FT opinion crowd or the Economist, they're kind of rather predisposed to the idea that transport projects are the way to build the economy. And this is a cross-party kind of consensus idea. And it sits alongside things like high-speed railways are a good idea, renewable energy is a good idea, etc. So I feel a bit like Dieter Helm, who had to Informer BBC journalist. He's a professor of transport economics and energy economics at Oxford, and Dieter had to say to the BBC, "I've got news for you. Solar energy doesn't work at night." And I think I'm making that kind of point here, that there will be a positive effect from these schemes, but it will not be transformational. And I think there's lots of evidence to support that view. To give you two examples, in general, transport infrastructure in mainland Europe is better than in America. But in general, economic growth in American cities has been much higher over long periods of time. So it doesn't look as if it's like the only thing that determines outcomes for city regions. Second example would be from the UK in the 1970s, in the Harold Wilson government. The go-ahead was given to big projects that mainly came online in the late 70s, early 80s. So things like the Mersey Loop, the Argyll line reopening in Glasgow, Tyne-and-Wear Metro. And those are all good projects, and we take them for granted, and we like them. But they did not lead to massive improvements in the economies of those places. Now, where I think the government is right and the regions are right, and Boris Johnson was right, but this is actually far predates Boris Johnson. If you look at UK economic performance on a GDP per capita basis, what you see is, I think, an extraordinary picture. In London and the South East, there are lots and lots of very rich people and very rich businesses. Now, in London, there's lots of poor people as well, but the average incomes are incredibly high, and they affect national economic data. But the average person in West Yorkshire, Greater Manchester, etc., is now no wealthier, maybe in many cases poorer, than people in Central Europe. And so there is an issue, which is that the long-term economic performance of the Midlands and Northern city regions is very poor. If we could improve that performance, it would be beneficial not just to the residents of those places, but basically to everyone in the country. But everyone then jumps to the idea that the problem is, there are not enough trams going to Eccles or something. And that is, unfortunately, not the answer. And if you go to Eccles, as I've done, you'll see that it's not the answer. So I'm not at all saying that these schemes are vanity projects or that they won't add something to the economy. I think in many cases they will. My observation is, first of all, they're incredibly expensive compared to some of the alternatives and similar schemes, say, in France. And secondly, they're probably not what's really going to get the economy going in some of these places, which I totally agree needs to happen.
So why do you think they are so more expensive, David? Because the numbers are eye-watering.
Yes.
We're talking between 5 and 10 times more expensive than, say, sort of a bus scheme, for instance. I'm not sure what the comparatives are with France. You mentioned that, but
two to three times.
2 to 3 times.
The
Why
tram
is
system.
that?
So if you compare these schemes, a light rail scheme in the UK with a bus scheme, I mean, so let's break it down and deal with the two things separately. On the bus versus light rail, bus obviously has a structural advantage in the sense that you only have to build your dedicated track where you need it. The Lee guided busway or whatever, you only have the track where you need the track or where you can build the track, and elsewhere you use the public road. So that's one reason. I think a second reason why the scheme costs have gone up is that UK light rail has started to look a lot like heavy rail. So we've imported some of the problems of heavy rail. And you can see this kind of with anecdotal things around the network where people are building light rail. For example, when I was involved in building Midland Metro Line 1, it's got essentially kind of 19th century tramway overhead. It looks like the Manx Electric Railway overhead. It's poles with wires dangling from them and so on. Other UK light rail systems that look like they're expecting a TGV to be, diverted through anytime soon. And, there are those kind of over specification problems. I think another problem is the tendency to specify different equipment in each system. The French systems are all basically using a kind of model railway approach where we've got the same track units, the same kind of trams. You are allowed to have a different front end on the trams. In Paris, they more or less have a different front end on every route, but they are basically the same tram. And a lot of the technology follows that standard pattern. So I think that helps. That also feeds through in building the thing, because I think the more standard it is, the easier it is to build the next one. If you've built one before with the same rolling stock, the same track components, overhead, etc.
You're absolutely right. I mean, this kind of non-standardization just leads to more cost and more cost. And isn't that where the problem really lies, which is to be able to do these, you're going to have to issue more gilts.
Yes.
Government's going to have to borrow money. And that has to be repaid. I mean, our debt burden is so huge now. So all these schemes are actually going to create big debt burdens that has to be repaid for these regions for the rest of time.
Yeah, so I think you've got to ask yourself the question, like, what is the chain of incentives and who's paying for what? But you're absolutely right, Richard. So basically what's happening is, if you're a local authority in some city, you write a nice letter with a long report to the DfT, and if you're lucky, they give you some money, and that will be measured in hundreds of millions or even billions. I mean, Manchester has had billions of grants over the years from the UK Treasury and the EU and so forth. Now, that money is effectively free money to the recipient. So I think problem number one is that it's a free gift. It doesn't necessarily need to be repaid. Now, that, of course, is an incentive to spend more money, because, why not have the Rolls-Royce version rather than the cheap version? The second problem, I think, is a political confusion that goes back to our earlier discussion, which is, well, if we spend 800 million, that's better than spending 700 million. That's actually not correct. It would be better to spend either 800 million more widely and have more miles of tramway, rather than spending 800 million on one route. I think that there's a confusion there that arises from the free money problem. But you're absolutely right. What's effectively going on is that the UK government will issue gilts. So the Treasury will issue gilts, i.e. government debt. And that money will then be gifted to the local transport authorities. Now, where I disagree with you, Richard, is the UK problem with debt is hardly at all to do with transport, because our UK debt in 1997 was 30% of GDP. It's now about 100% of GDP. If we include the PFIs and public sector pensions, it might be 150% of GDP. And to put some further numbers on this, of the UK government spending every year, about 10% is going on debt interest, not on debt repayment. They're not doing any debt repayment. 10% is just debt interest. Now, that is double the entire defence budget or double the entire transport budget. So it's quite possible to say it doesn't really matter about any of these schemes, because at the margin, it's a gnat's crotchet on the total government debt. But of course, if Rachel Reeves accepts that argument from every spending entity in the country, debt will spiral out of control. And this is what I call the chocolate biscuits problem. And you'll hear people saying, well, the 900 million for the Rutland light rail project is immaterial because the NHS spends 900 million each week on chocolate biscuits. So, we don't care about 900 million. This is the road to ruin. So I think that my criticism is that, yes, we should have more light rail projects, but they need to be A, delivered at lower cost, and B, allocated to the right routes. And I think the problem that's hidden by the announcement is who's going to pay for the deficits, because most of these schemes, once they're opened, they won't cover their wheel turning costs. So there will be a perpetual requirement, as you've said, to subsidise them into the future. And again, the expectation will be that the Treasury should pay that money via the DfT.
But surely, in defence of light rail as well, they are more likely to attract people and modal shift, get them out of their cars, than bus schemes are.
Yes.
There is evidence of the premium product, and boy, are they premium for these prices. But there is evidence that they attract people more. Is that fair?
I think that is fair. I think the question is the relationship of the rate at which they attract more people versus the cost. So, I mean, again, to put some simple numbers on these things, a new Sheffield tram, the latest Sheffield trams, I think cost about 4 million quid a pop. So, that's well over 10 times more. And obviously they still need track and overhead to operate. So to improve the cost benefit ratio, they need to be attracting passengers at more than 10 times the rate. So I think they are attracting, light rail definitely does attract more passengers than equivalent bus schemes, but not commensurate to the rate at which the costs are going up. Now, I want to be more positive about light rail, Richard, than I'm probably sounding. Again, if we jump back to Paris and look at some of the Paris schemes, and it's a similar story in France. I mean, in Germany, they always kept the trams. In France, most of them closed down, and they've rebuilt a lot of tram systems in France over the last 35, 40 years, more than in the UK. But it's a similar time horizon. The Paris ones will show absolutely mind-boggling patronage. So I looked at some numbers before this call. I mean, Line T3, which is a circular service, something like the Outer Circle bus route at West Midlands Travel of my former employ, That's carrying about 100 million passengers per annum on.
Wow.
And that's double the patronage of the Docklands Light Railway, which is the busiest light rail system in Britain, almost functioning now. It's become almost part of the underground. So why is that doing better? I mean, I think that's about route selection and also tram priority. It's the same argument we use with buses. You really want your trams to be going briskly, and they need to be on the right routes. So if you take the Paris arrangement, if it's true that they were able to build the T3 tram route at half the cost of the Midland Metro extension to Edgbaston per mile, and they're carrying 5 or 6 times more passengers, that will be delivering a much better cost-benefit ratio and much better value for the taxpayer. It won't be making a profit, of course. I mean, they'll still be subsidising it, but it will be, it's really almost functioning as an underground line. I mean, when you get to that kind of volume of patronage, you're really competing with underground. And then good examples from the UK, the Altrincham-Manchester-Bury line replacing heavy rail, that was a very, very good project from the passenger perspective, because when you got to Victoria Station, instead of having to walk or take a bus, you carried on the tram, you could get off at Piccadilly Gardens. They doubled or trebled the service frequency. Those kind of deployment of light rail, they can generate, really large benefits. So I think it's horses for courses.
So I was going to say less effective, Sheffield, which feels like a British transport system, a tram system or a German tram system in the 1950s.
Correct.
So much street running, and it just sits in the same traffic jams that all the buses sit in.
That's exactly right. I mean, they've got insufficient tram priority in Sheffield. But there's another way of looking at this, coming back to what is the justification. Because, I was in Sheffield recently. I used to live in Sheffield when I worked for British Rail briefly. And the city centre is very, very depressed. And the retail offer has been in decline and so forth. So that's despite having had, the tram for 30 years. And it's a Rolls-Royce piece of engineering, the Sheffield Tramway, and it's being generally very well run by Stagecoach. Now it's being run by the PTE directly, but it's not been poorly run. Some of the equipment is now wearing out. It's coming to the end of a normal life. So I think that what Sheffield kind of illustrates is having a very nice tramway by itself, my earlier point, doesn't solve the economic problem. The economic problems of Sheffield are more complicated than not having enough trams. I am in favour of light rail. I would like to see more light rail. I think there's all sorts of scope to do clever things with light rail, but it needs to be more like the Paris solution, not sitting in traffic jams and not over-engineered.
We'll pull the threads of this together when we review the spending review next week. But for now, it feels very much as if we've been subjected to quite a bit of smoke and mirrors by the government, and that really irritates me. Now, some will say that Network North was a cynical exercise, cooked up in a Manchester hotel room over the minibar at 2 a.m, armed only with the contents of that minibar and the advice of an HS2 hating ideologue. It was totally unfunded and would never actually happened had the Conservatives won in 2024. However, can we be confident it will really happen this time? 2027 is a long way away in political terms, and much can change in a month, it seems, never mind 2 years. Just look what we've seen with the pensioners' fuel allowance reversal. Right, let's move on and talk about fares. Nothing going to cause any controversy there, is it? Or more specifically, the fact that each year an increasing number of people seem to try and evade paying them, often quite successfully, and what the railway companies are doing about it. Last week, on June 4, ORR published an independent report entitled An Independent Review of Train Operators' Revenue Protection Practices. Richard, you've done your thing with official reports and you've read it exhaustively. And I'm sure that was a challenge because I bet it was a big, thick one. So how did it come about? And more to the point, what's it actually say?
Well, it is quite the read. It's about 150 pages long. You can kind of weigh it as well as kind of look at it.
I'm so pleased you're good at these things.
Yeah, having said that, it's a really easy read.
Okay.
It's one of the, it's well written, and it's not quite as, it's certainly not as impenetrable as some of the lengthier tomes in the past. Now, why did it come about? Well, it came, if you remember, because we talked about this on the show, when the chief magistrate last August quashed
Oh, yes, I do.
6
Yeah.
test cases. And they were convictions, fair evasion convictions, that had come about using a thing called the single justice procedure, the SJP,
Wrongly
which was
used,
like a
wasn't
fast
it?
track court thing. Yeah. And what they'd actually done, the actual fair evasion in each of the cases was probably not really in doubt. Certainly in some of them, there was a procedural error. You know, the train company should not have used that route. And as a result, it led to 59,000 convictions being quashed, right?
Many of which were probably justified in.
Indeed so, and the ORR say that in the report. So even though it was a technical error, what it also said was, hang on a minute, is there a process failing here? Who's controlling this? And what's the oversight? And, are the train companies on top of the process here? So Louise Haigh, who was the Secretary of State at the time, asked the ORR to conduct an independent review of train operators' revenue protection policies and practices. And this report is that review.
And I have a sense, Richard, that it doesn't say that everything in the garden is going well.
It doesn't. In fact, when you read it, it's one of those reports, like you kind of turn the page, it goes, and another thing, and another thing, and another thing. And you kind of go flipping out, And by the time you get to the end, you're a bit exhausted. I think it's a bit of a damning indictment
Really?
on the fares system generally. Yeah. Because although, look, everybody, who works
from
in the industry, we all accept fair evasion is a crime and it costs the railways a lot of money. In fact, I believe estimates up to about $500 million a year.
Really?
So
it's that much?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and some people anecdotally believe it's higher than that. But nonetheless, that's, a reasonable estimate. But the problem is the systems that have been put in place to try and prevent it and catch it are at times confusing, they're indiscriminate, they're disproportionate, and they're implied in an inconsistent way. I mean, apart from that, it's all fine, right? And that's a concern. So to try and gain a little bit more understanding, I thought the easiest thing to do would be to speak to somebody very, very close to this at the ORR. And we were able to speak with Stephanie Tobin, who's the Director for Strategy, Policy and Reform at the ORR. And this was what Stephanie had to say.
Okay.
I must say, Stephanie, this report is a gripping read. It's a page turner, but it was one of those that the more you read it, as I turned every page, I was just like, wow, because it was one thing and then another thing and then another thing. I suppose if you had to pick one or two of the most crucial themes out of this report, though, what would they be?
It's a great question, Richard, and it's looking back at it. Obviously, it's been a week or so since we published. It is very clear to me that actually the latter part of the report is definitely the most impactful. So the whole area of prosecutions and the concept there is not consistency in how operators are actually testing whether it's appropriate to prosecute. So you really need sufficient evidence, and you need to be doing it in the public interest. And those 2 points are so fundamental that while some people seem to be doing it extremely well, others we were left with quite significant question marks. So for me, that was one of the key areas. The second area is really around when all these things happen and things can go wrong, and we all experience that in different walks of life. You expect a route to be able to make a clear challenge, and some of the tools being used, they're not very familiar, they're not set out in legislation, and so you're left with a bit of a, well, where do I go now? How can I say this is not fair? That was very surprising, and I think that should also be addressed quite urgently.
So those are two very clear themes. I agree. Just on that first one about that sort of inconsistency in approach. Look, without naming any names, and you've quite rightly anonymized all the case studies anyway, it does feel as if, through a combination of strict liability or the penalty fares regime and the way that that's applied, or some of the other tools, that some TOCs, it felt to me they've almost been punishing passengers for, in some cases, minor indiscretions, and in some cases securing convictions that you said yourself in the report, they are disproportionate. and they can have life-changing consequences. I mean, that can't be right, surely. I mean, is that something that just has to be addressed and quickly?
So we didn't look to take away any of the powers that the talks have. So we haven't called that out and said that there's too many tools available here. It is important that they can use tools that they think are appropriate, that they can adapt their approach to their commercial environment, and different talks do different things. They'll put different amount of staff into revenue protection, adopt different approaches. But it is exactly as you said. The real consequences of some of this, are they really being taken into account? Is somebody overseeing that and going, well, is this what we really want to achieve here? And that wasn't entirely clear, that there is a sort of oversight or framework of that whole process. I mean, we didn't come away with the sense that there's a punishment going on here, but I can see that individual passengers will feel very much like that, particularly where they feel they have made an innocent mistake. But the challenge is for the operator to work that out, and then to provide sufficient safeguards that actually they make a mistake, they do perhaps go down the penalty fares route, but then sufficient evidence then the passenger provides, then they can then reverse out of that. And that just isn't clear. It is an absolute minefield of legislative requirements, as you've indicated.
So that sort of takes us on to something which I think is key, because we've got to be clear: fare evasion is a crime, right? If you deliberately set out to travel without any intention of paying, that's a crime. And frontline staff, and that can either be on the train or at stations or in booking offices, wherever, do find themselves very much in the forefront of this and having to deal with some quite challenging situations, sometimes confrontations. I saw one recently myself on GWR. The train manager handled it superbly, but they can be quite tense moments. I mean, the sheer volume of ticket irregularity notices that the one talk in particular I know has been issued really does stand out. Do you think train companies themselves need to up their game in terms of how they train and support staff when they're dealing with situations where they're having to make what could end up being, life-changing decisions?
We did find that. We did look at training, but as you yourself well know, you can have a very good training manual. How that is then implemented in practice, how it's tested, whether it happens face to face, whether you're given it to read, it really varies. And you can imagine, if you're a new member of staff and you're faced with quite a lot of things to learn here, to what extent are you then applying those processes effectively? So there's a great deal of subjectivity in all of this, and we had thought quite seriously about whether or not there should be some sort of accreditation process here, because exactly as you say, staff are taking decisions that have life-changing impacts potentially on passengers. So what is the level of skill required to do that? So I do think that's a valid point. It is in the report, but we can see there is a lot of training going on, but just whether or not it needs to be made more formalised needs to be considered.
Okay. And another thing I suppose to add to the in tray of whoever leads GBR in the future. Look, this is a serious report, and it felt to me like it demanded a serious response. What in summary, what would you now like to see done, and who do you expect to see do it in response to this?
So it's very hard for us to preempt how DfT will respond to this. The points I made to you about effectively this consistent test for prosecution, for me, that one is absolutely fundamental. I think that could be underway now. I think DfT could look at that very quickly and assess what's going on. But then somebody needs to then pull that together. So in the absence of GBR, it is possible that perhaps the Rail Delivery Group could do more. We could certainly offer to do more, but I also think there's a real possibility that the operators that have already come into public ownership could really set basically set the trend here and be used to demonstrate how this could all work better. But I do think some things here, they can't wait for GBR. We've been very clear about that. And I am expecting expecting that DFT will agree with that when they see the full report and really look into the detail.
It's a serious report. It requires an equally serious and urgent response. And I think if people like me can come away having read this and gone, flipping heck, I'm a bit concerned by this, then your average passenger is going to surely be very concerned. It's a barrier to travel. So some decisions, big decisions, need to be taken. You can't produce a report like this and then not act.
Well, GBL is going to be an opportunity to introduce some sort of consistency in
Hope
process,
so.
Isn't it? Because we've all heard the stories. As one I saw in the paper last week about some guy who'd spilled a drink on the ticket documentation, so it wasn't scannable and readable. And even though he was later able to produce, he had the ticket and all the rest of it, because he didn't have it with him at the time, he ended up being prosecuted. Ludicrous.
Yeah. And there's a few other case studies like that. And you read and you go, what?
We keep hearing, because it's very obvious in these cases whether something passes the reasonable test or not, isn't it?
You would like to think so.
And it's got to be that. Okay, sticking with ORR, some important news on the European front as well this week, with the release of a letter by the ORR to the aspirant, that's a good word, isn't it? Aspirant operators on the UK's current high-speed network. Regular green signallers will recall we covered the issue of Temple Mills Maintenance Depot a little while back, and in particular, the question as to whether there was sufficient capacity for a new operator to come in and use that depot's facilities. The ORR appointed an independent consultant to write a report, asked all the potential operators what they thought of the report's conclusions, and they, ORR, have now written to all the aspirant operators to explain what the next steps will be. It's quite the process, Richard. So what happens now?
It is quite a process, but I can understand why the ORR are doing it this way, because obviously they're trying to limit the risk of challenge, right? So, and they want to do a proper job, so that's fair enough. Now, interestingly, the press statement that the ORR put out on the 5th of June when they talked about what the next steps were was most revealing, okay?
Okay.
Noting that they'd commissioned the independent report you've just mentioned by a company called IPEX, I think, at Temple Mills, the ORR statement said this: ORR subsequently gave stakeholders, including the incumbent Eurostar, an opportunity to provide evidence that would change or support the report's findings. ORR has now reviewed this evidence and concluded that the independent assessment is an accurate reflection of available capacity at Temple Mills.
Okay.
Taken together with Eurostar and applicants' initial plans, and here's the killer phrase, right? The assessment suggests there is room for at most one new operator or for Eurostar to grow, right?
Okay.
Not and, or. So that's important because Eurostar themselves would like to grow. We've seen this week as we're recording an announcement that they're going to launch direct services to Frankfurt and Geneva. That is growth, okay? So the ORR have now said, okay, in order for them to make a final determination under the sort of Section 17 applications, each of the aspirant operators, including Eurostar as the incumbent, must now submit final representations by the 31st of July, which must provide the detail of their plans so the ORR can decide on the best allocation of capacity, which I believe they then intend to do by the end of October.
Have I just got a suspicious mind, Richard, because they conclude that either there's room for an operator or Eurostar can grow, and all of a sudden Eurostar wants to grow? Interesting timing or not? Anyway, now the ORR has said it will assess bidders' plans using a range of assessment criteria, which include the availability of capacity, how proposed services will impact operational performance, financial and operational readiness and viability, economic and societal benefits associated with the applications, and the views of stakeholders. Now, does that favour anyone in particular, do we think?
Well, it could do, because it's not just about money. It's about lots of other things as well. And, I might be prepared to invest more than you, but you might be a lot more prepared to start next week, right? So, there's the trade-offs, and that's what that balance criteria is trying to do, and it kind of makes sense, really. I think the financial and operational readiness point is interesting.
Yeah.
There's some suggestion, I think, that Evelyn stroke Trenitalia, they obviously have an MOU. They've obviously got a lot of financial muscle there. And there's rolling stock potentially down the line that they could use. But look, that's speculation. We're going to have to wait and see. There's still clearly an awful lot still to be determined. And, it's not particularly straightforward. I mean, whatever happens, though, Nigel, I have to say, Virgin's claim way back when they made it that the last hurdle had been cleared is, as we suggested it might do, looking presumptuous and maybe a bit silly, that there is still a fair amount for everybody to do, and we won't know until the ORR have made a determination.
I'd describe it more as informed insight and analysis, Richard, than speculation. But
okay, right.
There you go. Right. We shall keep our finger on that pulse as ever, and we will report back as things develop. But for now, it's time to thank everyone who supports us. First of all, our thanks to RIA, the Railway Industry Association, our programme supporter, and to Rail Business Daily, our media supporter. Then a big thank you everyone who has left us a super thanks again this week on YouTube. We so appreciate this. And you all are Stu Anderson, Alan Kirkman, Andrew Seddon, Nigel Mapston, Adrian Headley, Graham Whitley, John Kirkman, Bob Walsh, Alistair Rutledge, Zach Shaler, Maxstar 2010, Chris Exley, and Callum Thornelow. And we really do appreciate all those super thanks, because everyone helps us inch towards sustainability for the long term, doesn't it, Richard?
It does. And thanks also to our members who we list in the end credits of the show. Thanks to our new members, gold and silver members, Kung Fu Squirrel, that's a great name, isn't it? And Phil Craig. Thank you very much. We really do appreciate your support. If you are a gold or silver member, don't forget to let us have your address so that we can send you the stuff that you get as part of your membership. But thank you to everybody.
Indeed so. And now it's time for this week's Railway News Roundup. The rollout of new 5-car Class 730/2 trains for London North Western Railway began earlier this week. So thanks to Ian Stewart, former chair of the Transport Select Committee, an old friend, for sending us some photos from the launch event at Euston last week. The trains are part of a £1 billion investment on the line and will apparently add 15,000 extra seats every day. Wow. Increasing capacity by 20%. Built by Alstom in the UK, the new trains will initially be used on services stopping at Northampton, Bletchley, Milton Keynes and Watford. But more destinations will have the new trains by the end of the year or early 2026, so we'll keep an eye on them.
We will. Now, First Group has submitted the first phase of a new open access application between Hereford and London for Lumo. They say it will support further investment in new trains. You recall they placed the order in December last year for 14 trains from Hitachi, and there's an option for a further order of a similar size. The first one was worth about 500 million. And the Hereford fleet would form part of that. It's not all of it, but part of it. The application is for 2 return journeys a day, one on a Sunday, between Paddington and Hereford, calling at Bristol Parkway and 7 Tunnel Junction, as well as providing direct London services for Cwmbran, Pontypool and New Inn and Abergavenny. They hope that if successful, the new service would begin in December 27. I still haven't changed my view, though. I think this is causing us a distraction at the moment, all these open access things. But there we go. They're entitled to make the application, and they have.
They are certainly making the most of it, aren't they? Here's a related Lumo story then, Richard. Alstom has secured a £50 million contract to enhance and service Lumo's fleet of Class 222s, supporting 50 roles across Alstom's sites in Cheshire and Staffordshire. The contract with First Group and Eversholt Rail covers refresh and maintenance of 5 6-car Meridians, ahead of the launch of services between Stirling and London, which we mentioned last week on the show. The fleet modernisation programme, which accounts for £10 million of the contract value, will be carried out at Alstom's Widnes site to install new seating, Wi-Fi, a repaint to Lumo's branding, and new modern technology.
It's all good. But interesting point. Somebody made the observation on YouTube, I think it was Simon Pilkington actually, pointed out that, of course, Meridians, the 222s, are not fitted with TAS, the tilt authorization system. So therefore, when they're running on the West Coast on the Stirling service, they will not be able to tilt and they will be restricted to 110 miles an hour. Now, I don't know. I'm not sure whether Network Rail modelled all the sectional running times at 110 or even 12 or at 125. But again, capacity. There's an issue there. But nonetheless, there we go. They've got the paths.
So not just short trains, but slow trains.
Well, not able to make full use of the tilt line speed, no. Or the 125 mile an hour line speed, no. Here's an HS2 story from this week. Engineers, I love these because I've been to one of these deck slides. They're amazing. Engineers slid the first section of the 320-metre long M6 South Viaduct into position at the weekend. The east deck was slid into place over a slip road during a 29-hour closure. In fact, the road reopened to traffic 11 hours earlier than planned, which was brilliant.
Hooray.
Using non-stick pads like you get on your frying pans. I think it's something called PTFE or polytetrafluoroethylene. It's
easy for you to say.
Easy for you to say, yeah. It's the same stuff that they used on the small Dean deck slide, which we showed in a previous show. The first slide was 119 metres, and the viaduct is assembled to the side of the road, and then it's slid in place over 3 weekends. You'll love this, Nigel. The weight of the deck increases as each slide takes place because the second one needs to push the first, and then I think the third one then pushes the second and the first one. You know what I mean? One of those, right? So they pushed 1,300 tons this weekend, but the final slide will be 3,290 tons. It's amazing.
I hope it moves when they press the button.
Quite slowly, I suspect.
Yeah, but they're getting very good at these bridge slides, aren't they? I mean,
learning curve. There you go.
That other one that you went to, where you said it was as longer than an aircraft carrier, stuck in my mind. What an achievement! And not for the first time. We tip our hats to the skills of HS2 engineers who are doing an amazing job. And here's another with more HS2 Tunnel Boring Machine news this week, one that answers my recent pondering about what happens to the TBMs when they've done their job on HS2, Richard. So, 125-metre long, 1,600-tonne Mary Ann is being stripped down and dismantled by specialist engineers from Balfour Beatty, Vinci, ready to return to Hereford-London in Germany, where she was built. Mary Ann excavated the 3.5-mile first section of the Bromford Tunnel, spending 652 days and nights working underground, munching away. Once returned to Germany, it's expected that the machine will be refurbished and adapted, ready for another tunnelling adventure somewhere else. And here's the good bit, Richard. The first stage of the process to dismantle Mary Ann involved the 8.62 metre diameter, 120-tonne cutter head being lifted out of the 22-metre deep tunnel portal in Washwood Heath by a 700-tonne crawler crane. It's hard to even comprehend the size of these beasts, isn't it?
They're just massive numbers, aren't they? They really are. No, it's fantastic. Before we leave the news round, a couple of stories which have just popped, the last few days, which I thought were mentioned, which a couple of listeners have sent to us. First one, Alfreton Station. Alfreton Station's just had a £6.75 million upgrade, including accessibility by the way of the lifts and then the overbridge that allows people to get from one side to the other. All good stuff. But they've opened it and they've said, to begin with, whilst we bring the lifts into service, they'll only be open for certain times of the day and they won't be open on Sundays. Now, I understand why they need to commission stuff, right? You'd think they would do the commissioning as almost like a soft, almost like not even mention it. And then when it was open, they would say it's open and there's no restrictions. I think they've made a bit of a rod for their own back there. I don't know what you think, but I mean, they're either working or they're not working if you're a passenger. So
exactly. So, the lifts are there one day and if they're gone the next. But I think the real problem is things very easily take root, don't they? And if it takes root in the public consciousness, it is very likely, the lifts at that station don't work on Sundays, we're not going to go by train.
that's the risk.
It can be really difficult to root out that belief. And I think it's just plain silly. Get them fixed, get them working, get them open, the end.
Yeah, we know you have to commission it, so commission them and then announce it. No, agreed. The other story is the switching on of the electrification on the East Midlands, on the Midland Main Line, up to, I think, from Kettering to not quite Leicester. So it's actually South Wigston, right? At which point the wires stop. It's a bit like when I come home to Chippenham. We get to Wootton Bassett Junction and then, the pan comes down and we switch over to diesel. And I guess that's what will happen here. I mean, please, I'm not decrying the work that the team who delivered it have done. They will have done a really super job.
As usual.
Well done. Congratulations. However, Midland Main Line, is it on? Is it off? Is it on? Is it off? I mean, and I'm worried about this discontinuous electrification stuff on lines like Midland Main Line. It should go to Leicester. It should be wired to and through Leicester. And so, yeah, great that there's a bit more of it, but come on, let's just get the whole route wired.
And the problem is, because they can switch over on a buy mode, that it'll never get done.
That's the fear. That's the fear.
And when you've got freight around, you need 25 kV in the overhead throughout. Like I've got,
or you need like one of John Smith's new Class 99s, which are humongously expensive because they've got a 2,500 horsepower diesel engine as well as an 8,500 horsepower electric system.
8,500 horsepower.
Yeah, something like that. I think somebody will probably correct me, but it's that order of magnitude.
When we think, Richard, compared with your beloved Class 40s, which were what, 2,000?
Yes, on a 133-ton locomotive. Yeah, no, it's a bit different generation.
It was different times.
But
I'm not being critical. I'm just saying, it just shows how things have moved on. How
totally agree.
You can get a lot of horsepower now out of.
If it's a strategic main line, get the wires up.
Get the wires up.
There you go.
The end. So that's the news. If you'd like to send us any snippets of news, you can drop us an email at news@greensignals.org. Notice I've remembered again. We can't promise to read them all out, but the best ones we will. And if we use yours, your name will appear alongside it.
Which means it's now time to do the quiz.
Hooray!
Now, last week's
question...
This
is going to be interesting, isn't it?
It is a bit interesting. The last week's question was from listener Paul Godwin, and it was this. Where on Britain's railway was there a station bearing the title of junction, but was never an interchange point? Now, by interchange point, we meant at some point in its history, even if not anymore, you could change between different, lines and services. So a couple of people said, Clapham Junction, because you've got to kind of cross a bridge or go over to other platforms onto a different side of the station. No, that is an interchange point because you can get off there and you can go and get on a different service. So we didn't allow that or others like it. There were some very clever answers. There were a few we didn't allow. Barnstaple Junction, no, because it once was an interchange, I believe. Same for Bursker Junction. Same for Verney Junction and Boscarn Junction. Ones we did allow, you'll love this, Junction Road Station in Edinburgh on the line to North Leith. Never a junction. Just called Junction Road, I think, because of the name of the road junction. Yeah. Coombe Junction on the Loo to the Loo branch in Cornwall. That was a little bit more complicated, that one, because of what was there before, but I think that's okay. Junction Road for Hawkhurst, or Junction Road on the Kent and East Sussex Railway. Excellent answer. Keema Junction, very clever answer that, because the original station at Keema Junction was actually on the, I think it was on the Burgess Hill line, or the line to Lewis, sorry, and it wasn't on the main line. So, but another very clever one was Heathrow Junction, which of course was a temporary station after the tunnel collapse when they were building Heathrow Express, and it was a terminus built in basically no time at all. We may come back to this in a car park at Stockley Park, but it was just a terminus. It was not a junction as in railway terms. So that was a correct answer. No one got the actual answer we were looking for, Nigel, which was
that's a bit of a first, isn't it?
Yeah, which was Barnwell Junction, which is just north of Cambridge, on the line that used to go to Fordham. Because even though it was called Barnwell Junction, the platforms at the station were only on the line to Fordham, not on the main line north to Ely. So that was the answer we were looking for. No one got it, but we thought it was the only one, and it wasn't. There was quite a few others. Anyway, the winner, randomly chosen from all the correct answers we had, was James Taylor, who actually had said Junction Road Halt. So well done, James. If you send us an email to quiz@greensignals.org, we will get your mug out to you in due course. An easy one this week, I think.
Hooray.
When did British Rail run its last ever steam train? Okay. When did British Rail run its last ever steam train? If you think you know the answer to that, quiz@greensignals.org by midday on Saturday. I'm just trying to work it out. What is it? Saturday, what is it? Because my mind has gone a complete blank. It must be the 7th. It must be the 14th, right? Saturday, the 14th of June, and we'll put all the correct answers into a hat, and we'll draw one out at random. We'll get one of our very special quiz winners mugs.
I think you're going to need a very big hat to put all the correct answers in.
Okay, good.
Right. Here's a positive one to end on, Richard, which we always like to do, don't we? A new exhibition is due to open in August that will use Scotland's National Archives, which are very good, to explore the history of railway tourism. The exhibition is called Scots on the Move, Railways and Tourism in Victorian Scotland, and will feature photographs, tourist guides, booklets, posters, letters, and other historic documents. Sounds really good, because there was some great art involved in all that, wasn't there? The free exhibition will be hosted in General Register House's Adam Dome on Princes Street in Edinburgh from August 4th to the 29th. So stick it in your diaries. That will be good.
It will.
And sadly, that's all we've got time for this week. So thanks ever so much, as usual, for watching and listening. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up, leave a comment, or if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel on YouTube. It really will help us. And if you really want to support us, find out about membership on YouTube or Patreon, for which you'll get all sorts of cool goodies. But most importantly, as usual, please join us again next week. Meanwhile, it's goodbye from me, and
it's goodbye from me.
Have yourselves a fantastic week.